She had a vision board. That's the detail that stays with you when you read through everything that came after: the interviews, the court documents, the testimony of people who watched it happen and said nothing, and the testimony of people who tried to stop it and were ignored. Before any of it, there was a 26-year-old woman sitting on the floor of a studio apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio, with a pair of scissors and a stack of magazines, cutting out photographs of cobblestone streets and sun-drenched terraces and plates of pasta that looked like they existed in a different universe entirely. She was building a vision board. She was building a life she hadn't lived yet. Her name was Mara Voss. Within 18 months, she would be in Italy. Within 2 years, she would be gone, not dead, but gone in the way that is sometimes worse than death. The way where you disappear so gradually that the people who love you don't know exactly when to start screaming. And by the time they did scream, by the time her mother filed the first missing persons report, and her college roommate started posting on social media, and her younger brother drove to the airport with a one-way ticket to Rome in his pocket, the people who had taken her had already had more than a year to build the walls that would keep her in. This is a story about how that happens. Not in the abstract. Not in the language of statistics and sociological trends and policy recommendations. In the specific human, heartbreaking way it actually happens in cafes and WhatsApp group chats and shared apartments and Sunday dinners where everything looks, on the surface, like friendship. Like community. Like exactly the life you came to a foreign country to find. This is a story about the machinery underneath that surface. And it is a story about how sophisticated that machinery has become, how carefully it has been designed to target exactly the people most likely to fall into it, and how completely invisible it is until the moment you are already inside it and the doors have already closed. Mara had studied graphic design. She was talented, her professors said so, her portfolio said so, the small agency in Cincinnati that hired her out of college said so. But she was also, by her own description in the journal she kept obsessively, deeply unhappy. Not clinically depressed, not in crisis, just unhappy in that quiet, pervasive way that a lot of young people are when they have done everything they were supposed to do and arrived at a life that fits them the way a suit fits someone who bought it in the wrong size. She had the job, the apartment, the relationship that was comfortable without being exciting. She had friends she liked but didn't love. She had weekends that passed without incident. She was, as she wrote in her journal with the dry humor that characterized most of her private writing, aggressively fine. And aggressively fine, she had decided sometime in her 25th year, was not enough. She wanted something real. She wanted to feel something. She wanted, and this is the phrase she used, the phrase that will echo through everything that comes after, she wanted to belong somewhere. She chose Italy because of a semester abroad in Florence during her junior year. Not Florence itself, she ended up in Rome, but the memory of Florence, the memory of being 20 years old and standing in a piazza at dusk and feeling, for the first time in her life, like the world was enormous and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been chasing that feeling for 5 years. She decided to stop chasing it and go get it. She researched visa options, found a remote freelance opportunity with a European design collective, sublet her apartment, put her furniture in storage, and bought a one-way ticket. Her mother cried at the airport. Her boyfriend, who had declined to come with her, hugged her for a long time and said, "I'll be here when you get back," which they both understood to mean that he wouldn't be. She got on the plane. She felt, for the first time in years, completely alive. The first 3 months were hard. This part is important because the hardness of the first 3 months is not incidental to what came later, it is essential to it. Rome is not a city that opens itself to you easily, especially if you are young and foreign and alone and don't speak more than tourist Italian. The freelance work was isolating. The apartment she'd found through an English-language expat forum was fine but anonymous, a furnished rental in Prati full of other transients who changed every few months. She went to language classes. She explored neighborhoods on long walks. She ate alone at restaurant bars and read novels on her phone and told herself this was romantic. This was the expat experience. This was what she had signed up for. But she was lonely. Profoundly, achingly lonely in the way that only a city full of people who all seem to know each other can make you feel. She wrote in her journal, "I am surrounded by life and I am not in any of it." She was ripe, although she didn't know it, for exactly what was about to find her. She met Sofia at a language exchange event in Pigneto. Language exchanges, events where native Italian speakers and foreign language learners pair up to practice on each other, are a staple of the expat social circuit in Rome, and they are, as it happens, a remarkably effective hunting ground for a certain kind of predator. Not because the predators attend the language exchanges themselves, necessarily, but because the language exchanges attract exactly the profile they're looking for: newcomers, people without established social networks, people who are actively, publicly looking for connection. Sofia was 29, Italian, warm in the specific way that makes you feel immediately seen, the way where she laughed at your jokes before you'd finished making them and leaned in when you talked and made you feel, within 20 minutes of meeting her, like you were already old friends. She had a large, loud group of friends who seemed to be everywhere at once, filling up terraces and trattoria and weekend trips to the coast. Within 3 weeks of meeting Sofia, Mara was inside that group. Within 6 weeks, she had moved into a shared apartment in Oshens with 2 women from Sofia's circle. Within 2 months, she was writing in her journal, with what you can only read now as terrible irony, "I think I finally found my people." Here is what Mara didn't know about Sofia. Here is what she had no way of knowing, because Sofia was very, very good at her job, and it was a job, although the salary was not paid in money. Sofia had been recruited into what Italian investigators would later describe, in a 200-page report that took 3 years and the cooperation of law enforcement agencies in 4 countries to produce, as a structured affinity group with coercive control characteristics, which is the precise clinical language that official documents use for what most people would call, in plain terms, a cult. Not a cult in the dramatic, compound in the desert, shaved heads and matching uniforms sense that the word tends to conjure. A modern cult. An urban cult. The kind of cult that has learned with extraordinary sophistication from the mistakes of its predecessors and evolved into something that is almost perfectly camouflaged as normal life. The kind of cult that doesn't ask you to give up your phone or your family or your identity. Not immediately, not obviously, not in ways that would trigger the alarm systems that most reasonably educated young people have been taught to watch for. The kind of cult that instead gives you everything you've been missing. Community, purpose, belonging, and waits. Because the giving always comes before the taking. And the taking, when it finally starts, happens so slowly that you don't notice it until you have nothing left to give and you no longer remember who you were before you had nothing. The group had a name that will not be used in this video at the request of the investigators still working the case, but among its members it was referred to simply as the family. It had existed in various forms in Rome for approximately 11 years, centered around a charismatic man in his mid-50s who went by a name that was not the name on his passport, and who had, over more than a decade, refined his operation to a degree that genuinely impressed the investigators who eventually dismantled it. He had, at various points in his life, been a psychology student in Milan, a management consultant in London, a practitioner of a minor spiritual movement in Switzerland, and a real estate broker in Rome. Each of these phases had contributed something to what he eventually built. The psychology gave him his vocabulary of manipulation. The management consulting gave him his understanding of organizational hierarchy and incentive structures. The spiritual movement gave him his template for devotion and the language of transformation. And the real estate gave him his infrastructure, a network of properties across Rome and the surrounding region that provided housing, workspace, and, crucially, isolation for the people in his orbit. By the time Mara walked into that language exchange in Pignito, he had approximately 40 people in various stages of involvement with the group. Some on the outer edges, like Mara, receiving warmth and friendship and a sense of home, and some deep in the center, like Sofia, who had been in the group for 6 years and whose entire social, financial, and emotional life was controlled by the man at the top. The recruitment playbook, as reconstructed from the testimony of 11 former members who eventually cooperated with investigators, was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Stage 1 was what members called love bombing, a term borrowed from the clinical literature on coercive control, though the group used it internally without apparent irony as a neutral descriptor of technique. Every new recruit was made to feel, in the first weeks and months of contact, like the most interesting, most seen, most appreciated person in any room they entered. The attention was not random. It was calibrated based on information gathered through casual conversation about what the recruit was missing, and recruits in Rome's expat community were reliably missing the same things: family, roots, a sense of purpose, the feeling of being truly known. The group provided all of it, in concentrated, intoxicating doses. Stage 2 was integration, the gradual weaving of the recruit into the group's social fabric so completely that their outside relationships began to atrophy. This happened naturally, organically, in ways that felt like choices. You spent the weekend with the group instead of the colleagues you sort of knew, because the group was more fun, more real, more alive. You didn't call home as much because you had so much to tell and not enough time. You let the old friendships drift because you didn't need them anymore, you had something better. Stage 3 was dependency, the point at which the recruit's emotional, social, and often financial life was sufficiently entangled with the group that leaving it was not a decision but an amputation. And stage 4, the stage that most recruits never saw coming, even the intelligent ones, even the cautious ones, even the ones who had read about exactly this kind of thing and believed, right up until the moment they were inside it, that they would recognize it if it happened to them. Stage 4 was control. Mara entered stage 3 in approximately her 7th month in Rome. The journal records the transition with painful precision, though she didn't recognize it as a transition at the time. The entries shift from exuberant to subtly anxious, a growing sense that she needed to be available, that absences from group events were noted and commented on, that certain expressions of independent opinion had been met with a coldness that dissipated only when she walked them back. She wrote, "I said something at dinner about wanting to visit a friend in Berlin, and the whole table went quiet in this weird way. Sofia talked to me about it afterward, very kindly, very gently, and explained that the group is going through an important period and everyone's presence matters. I don't know why, but I felt guilty for even mentioning Berlin. She didn't go to Berlin. She never went to Berlin." Within 4 months of that journal entry, she had stopped mentioning plans that didn't involve the group. Within 6 months, she had moved into a property managed by the group's real estate network, which meant that her housing was now contingent on her continued membership. Within 8 months, most of her freelance income was flowing through a group-affiliated creative cooperative, which meant that her livelihood was also contingent. The walls, built so slowly and so pleasantly that she had helped carry the bricks herself, were now complete.